We don't think that the carbon tax is the right instrument at this time, especially given the inflationary pressures that exist for families across the province.
Welcome back. As we've been discussing this morning, and as you just heard there, the calls are growing for the feds to push pause on their April 1st carbon price hike. 7 premiers are now voicing opposition to the policy after Liberal Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Andrew Furey joined the fray this week. The federal Conservatives, meanwhile, have warned they plan to force, quote, multiple votes on the issue this week. So what's the strategic risk for the feds in either doubling down or pressing pause on the carbon price increase? Our Sunday strategy session is here. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Corey Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst and former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hey, everybody.
Hey there.
Scott, I'll start with you. Look, we have talked about opposition to the carbon tax, provincially and otherwise, for weeks, for months, for almost years at this point. This time it's coming this week. It came from a normal ally, like a regular ally of the federal government and of the Prime Minister, Premier Andrew Furey in Newfoundland and Labrador. Does it matter that it's coming from that source versus the more conventional political foes the Prime Minister has?
I think it matters. You just see the breadth of opposition that's mounted, and so you're not just getting it from foes, but from friends alike. And, you know, I think in some ways this week you could really feel the full political weight of this policy and the pressure it places on the Prime Minister and his agenda. You know, and I would just say this as an old communications director: when your boss is answering a question differently every single day, even though the question is the same, it's a sure sign of trouble, that you're scrambling, that you're working to find a better response that maybe will resonate just a little bit more with people. And it's kind of like going through the 7 stages. You know, we've seen this week, you know, sort of denial and bargaining and persuading. And then, you know, frankly, on Friday with the response in reference to Anthony Furey, talking about the fact that Furey is just being guided by political imperatives, you almost start to see anger. And it's all a bad look. It's all born not of communication strategy, but of the fundamental policy position that the government has taken on the carbon tax. And so you've got an unpopular policy, and you can see the Prime Minister, particularly this week, really straining with the weight of how unpopular the carbon tax is and the political pressure it places on him personally as the Prime Minister.
To just jump off what Scott's saying, Corey, I mean, it was, I think you could sort of envelop or encompass everything the Prime Minister said this week by doubling down on the policy, but at the same time through, as he mentioned, like in various ways, including at one point where the response to concerns from premiers, as you know, expressed through a reporter, was an nearly 8-minute answer.
Yeah, well, no longer, it doesn't matter how long it takes to answer that question. I don't think it's going to change what the outcome is here. Like, if the government continues on the path with a carbon tax where you know, it's not just raising rates once, it's going to be raising rates twice before the next election. The chances of this re-election are between slim and none. And as the old saying goes, slim just left town. So, like, you know, when he talks about short-term thinking, I think he's got some very short-term thinking. There will not be a carbon tax if one way or another after the next federal election, if it maintains on its current trajectory. Because it's very difficult to see a political future for him if it does.
What did you think, Kathleen, of the positioning from the Prime Minister, sort of saying, I'm doing a hard thing because I believe it's in the best interest of the country in the long term. It won't make me popular in the short term, but then accusing premiers who oppose that tax, and now we know they're not just Conservatives, of being short-term thinkers?
Yeah, well, I think the Liberals understand that this policy is deeply unpopular, but they're trying to figure out a way around it. But I don't think actually kind of criticizing the premiers is going to be the way to go. I thought actually Guilbeault last week, we saw 2 things happen last week. Certainly Pierre Poilievre toured the East, and he did over the weekend as well. And Mr. Guilbeault toured Nova Scotia on Thursday. And his comments were really interesting because he kind of tried to move the 3%. Everyone's talking about the 3% that's going to go up on April 1st. He actually started to talk about the 20 cents that has gone up in terms of refinery costs, and tried to kind of direct voters' anger towards the oil and gas companies that, while yes, the carbon price has been going up quarter by quarter, their refinery costs have also been going up, kind of trying to kind of lay the blame at CEOs and ask the premiers directly why they weren't criticizing those corporations also for the price gouging that was happening. I'm not sure if that's going to wash. I know that price gouging is a concern of many Canadians, but I'm not sure if we're too far into this narrative, and the carbon tax is too unpopular for the Liberals at this point to try to change the channel.
Yeah, to be fair to the Prime Minister, Scott, and the Feds, like, I get the argument around their belief that it will be the most impactful instrument over time to reduce emissions and the significance of that. But it feels at times like they don't understand, or they must understand, but they're not really acknowledging that right now at this point in time, people cannot afford their groceries. And like any additional cost, even if it is over the long term better, like the short term matters to them at this moment.
Of course it does. And I do think the government recognizes it. It just cannot find a path around it. And, you know, if I had $1 for every time as a communications advisor, I was asked to come up with some clever line or some way of better telling a story that would allow you to avoid the implacable problem at the center of your policy, you know, I wouldn't need to worry about the carbon tax because I would be buying a home on Mars. Like, the challenge here is that this policy is unpopular and they're not going to find a way of short-circuiting it. I don't think that when you move to the defiant tone of, well, you know what, by God, this is the cast royal that Canada needs, and I'm the Prime Minister who's going to, you know, show the leadership in order to provide it to people. None of these things are effective. You can't, on the one hand, persuasively argue that you are tackling the affordability challenge when people see the eye test of the price going up at the pump on April 1st.
So what about the prospect of, and we talked about this before, abandoning the policy? Like, it does not, I should be clear, sound like they're going to do that anytime soon. Is it a point where you can just risk it all and be like, I think Scott brought this up on radio this week, like just say, okay, we're going to do something that might alienate a certain constituency of voters, but it might save us in the long term, and just throw the policy out? Or is that, has that time passed?
I think that's really the only viable option left for them at this point, because slowly but surely the world has been closing its ears to Justin Trudeau on these things. I have the sense that he feels this is, you know, coming off the heels of the Mulroney eulogies that have been going on, and public praise for him, you know, sticking to a tough course even though it was politically bad for him. Well, I think that the fundamental problem is this is a very different situation. This is a bad policy in its current context. You know, carbon tax might do something in the long term if, you know, there was additional innovation that had occurred on the technology side, if additional infrastructure was in place. But the reality for most people in most parts of this country is they're having trouble paying their rent or their mortgage or getting groceries on the table. And the idea of buying a new heat pump for their house, or changing the windows in their house, or buying an electric vehicle is not possible from a financial perspective. But without that stuff in place, it's just punishing people for living their lives. And not surprisingly, that's not politically very popular.
The irony is the reason that the carbon tax incrementally goes up over time is to augment against what Corey is talking about, right? To provide for the market mechanism to drive the alternatives. But right now, because of the cost of living, even that incremental difference is incredibly impactful, both from a tangible perspective and a political one.
I mean, the policy itself is so visible because it's supposed to be driving,
it's supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly, behavior change. And so people can see it. They see that 3 cents in a way they don't see other costs and increasing. But right now, in the context of this affordability crisis, when people are feeling so much pain, it's so hard to hold on to. But then you have to also remember Storm Fiona that hit the coast in 2022 in Newfoundland, or the summer firestorms that happened last summer, right? That evacuated major cities, right? And so how do we address those problems? How do we deal with it? And I think that the Liberals are not going to abandon the carbon tax. I think it's here to stay. But the thing is, can they ride through this political maelstrom? And it's only going to get worse. We know that in the lead up to April 1st, Pierre Poilievre will just come back. The House returns on Monday, and it's going to be another fight in the Commons.
And I think Corey mentioned, like, even if the election is in the fall of 2025, there's another hike next April 1st.
That's right.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Scott Reid, Corey Tonight, and Kathleen Monk.